This is Never Close the Inquiry with Nick Hagan. Welcome to Never Close the Inquiry, where I aim to demystify the right for the left and the left for the right, where if you come as a conservative, I want you to leave knowing a little bit more about liberals. And if you come as a liberal, I want you to leave knowing a little bit more about conservatives, with the whole idea that over time we'll create better conversations, better relationships, better arguments, and maybe 80 or 90 more steps down the road, a better country. All right. So I am here with Michael Baharaeen of the Liberal Patriot and the chief economist at the Liberal Patriot, if I understand correctly.
Political analyst.
Yes. Chief political analyst.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Sorry. All right. Okay. First off, thank you very much for joining me.
Yeah. Thanks for having me.
I have a number of questions, and let's start with this one. What is the Liberal Patriot?
Yeah. So Liberal Patriot is a Substack kind of startup. We formed back in 2021. It was kind of a part-time thing. And essentially the mission is to advocate for traditionally liberal values in sort of the vein of FDR. FDR's four freedoms. We're talking about also looking at things like equality and equality of opportunity. Kind of traditional democratic values, like capital D Democratic Party values that, you might attribute to the Obama era Democratic Party. And we're sort of pushing those values, and specifically from the left toward the Democratic Party, who, if for folks who have not read much of our stuff yet, we certainly we consider ourselves sort of good faith critics of the Democratic Party in some ways. And we sort of take them on from the center left. And essentially what we try to do is get them to think about their blind spots. In the recent years, the Democrats, and I'm sure we'll get into this a little bit later, but the Democrats have had some changes in their coalition that have sort of led them to not quite appear the same as they may have even 10 or 15 years ago, let alone 30 years ago and earlier. And in ways that sort of have detached from their values a little bit, their historical values. So we try to talk a lot about that to kind of, get the party to kind of see these things, see these blind spots, and to understand sort of where the public is and the ways in which the party has kind of strayed from public opinion, on various kind of hot button issues of the day, and how that has then manifested in bad election results for the party, including most recently in 2024. So that's a kind of a broad brushstrokes overview of it. And we cover demographic data. We do election results. We look at public opinions research and sociology research. We cover a wide gamut of broad topics in order to kind of help tell these stories to people, essentially.
That was a terrific overview. So that sparks a number of questions. So first off, what led to your involvement with the Liberal Patriot? What's your background? Where are you from? How'd you get here?
Yeah. So this is, it could be a long story. I'll try and kind of hit the main points here. So I'm originally from the Midwest, grew up in the Midwest, went to school in rural Missouri. So kind of have that background that I bring. I moved to DC around 2013 for grad school and to look for a job doing policy work. And I kind of fell backward into doing election analysis and research, and I really enjoyed it. So I kind of started to hone my skills doing that work. And then shortly after I started that was Donald Trump's first election win in 2016. And I always kind of reflect back on that time when it felt like there were sort of two different paths that folks on the left took. One was kind of the resist all the time path. Don't normalize Trump. That was kind of something we heard a lot. This is an aberration. We can't let him, govern essentially because he's sort of a threat to the republic.
Yeah.
There was another path of people who were, I think, certainly frustrated, saddened by his win. I think, had a lot of concerns about him as well, but who wanted to understand how this happened.
Yeah.
How had the Democrats, who in our minds had put up one of the most qualified nominees ever,
Mm-hmm.
how did they manage to lose, and not only lose, but lose to somebody like Donald Trump, who people kind of laughed off, including Republicans in the Republican primary that year, laughed off as kind of a buffoon.
Yeah.
And so there was something that a lot of us had missed going on in the country. And, I had sort of thought back to my time living in the Midwest and going to school in a small town. I have a lot of family who live in small towns in the Midwest, and I kind of knew a little bit of the cultural elements that were informing some of this. And I thought it was important that the Democrats start to talk about these things. And it didn't necessarily mean kind of giving up on the core values of the party that are about, including people and kind of, standing up for, the voiceless and these kinds of things. But it did sort of mean trying to at least have a better sense of, how so many people who had voted maybe twice for Obama had then switched and voted for Donald Trump, because that just didn't seem to compute for a lot of people. And
Yeah.
so I started kind of diving into that. I started, doing some of my own writing outside of my professional job, trying to kind of dig into the data, dig into, which groups had started to kind of leave the party and how did that happen. And then after 2020, I got a happenstance to meet with Rui Teixeira, who is one of our columnists at the Liberal Patriot. And we kind of formed a relationship. He invited me to do some occasional contributing to the Liberal Patriot, and then fast forward to last year when I came on full time. And I think their mission is exactly what I think is important to me right now, which is I think that we need to have two healthy political parties, or at least one. And I think that the Democrats still have some hope to be a healthy political party, but I think they've kind of either, if not lost their way, they have been sidetracked in some important ways that have come to their detriment electorally. And so I think a lot of the work that I'm interested in doing and am doing now is trying to kind of use my knowledge of the political landscape to kind of help steer them back in the right direction.
Yeah. So that's interesting. So there are a number of different directions we can go with this.
Mm-hmm.
And what one question I have, and in preparing for the interview, I read all of your recent articles and a number of the other Liberal Patriots, the other recent articles on the Liberal Patriot. I understand are there 3 or 4 full-time writers on there?
There's 4 of us.
4.
Yeah.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
One of them being, of course, Rui Teixeira, who I understand. Did he found it, or
He was one of the co-founders, correct?
he's one of the co-founders?
Yeah.
Okay, and and people might know him. He wrote a very influential book in 2002 on the emerging Democratic kind of majority,
Mm-hmm.
demographic majority,
Yeah.
that for a number of different reasons didn't entirely pan out how I think people
Correct.
anticipated.
Yeah.
But he did people might have seen him recently. He went on Jon Stewart just after the election. People, might have had an opportunity to watch that.
Yeah.
But Donald Trump is a particularly interesting character, I think, in that when he came on the scene, what he did, at least to some degree, would have defied existing polling.
Mm-hmm.
Like he hit at things, talking to some friends about it that support him. He spoke about things and identified things that once he mentioned them, they realized they had concerns about.
Yeah.
But before he mentioned them, they wouldn't have thought about and didn't think about.
Yeah.
And so I think the question that comes out of that is, on the Democratic side, is the right move to hope that someone comes along like that really drives the party in a particular direction, or is it to kind of do what I think they did to some extent with former Vice President Harris and focus group a candidate, for lack of a better verb?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's a good question. I mean, I think right now everybody's trying to figure out what does it look like for the Democrats. Who is the candidate that is going to kind of be that standard bearer heading into 2028, who can figure out kind of the formula for kind kind of defeating Trumpism, defeating MAGA, and getting the Democrats back on track. And I'll be honest, I don't know that there is a perfect formula for it. I do think that one of the things that Trump really tapped into, and I think you'll hear this from almost anybody, any of his voters that you talk to, is a kind of anti-establishment and anti-institutions sentiment, which is, people, a lot of people, and this kind of is regardless of politics, think that the government's not working how it should.
Yeah.
And so you've got a guy who comes along and says, look, the reason it's not working as it should is because you have a bunch of self-interested politicians in Washington who are in it for themselves. And, they're not paying any attention to you. They're not even caring to listen to you. Maybe they talk down to you. And I won't ever do that. I'll kind of be the person who is your mouthpiece, and I'll kind of, metaphorically punch them in the eye in DC. And it spoke to a lot of people who said, yeah, we're sick and tired of, sort of quote unquote politics as usual. And so, and what was interesting, and I think people kind of forget this a little bit, Obama tapped into kind of a similar sentiment when he ran in 2008.
Right.
He was very much an outsider. He was somebody who was kind of championing economic populism. I'm not of the DC swamp. He'd only been a senator for 2 years at that point. And, but I think, Obama seemed to fit the narrative that people had, I think, in some ways mistakenly taken from Ruiz and John Judas's 2002 book, that it was sort of a demographics or destiny. It's sort of this optimistic, very progressive looking future, as opposed to Obama was able to win the votes of a lot of white working class voters who have culturally moderate to conservative views, because he talked to them, not at them. And he also kind of tapped into some of this anger at DC. And so Trump was kind of in some ways a weird extension, like logical extension or continuation of that, just in other ways, very different. And so I think it kind of, confused people. And so, but I think that's kind of the through line that you see. And there was maybe a little bit of a blip in 2020 when we had a global pandemic, which is sort of an unexpected event that, kind of interrupted that. But then Trump comes back, and you see in all sorts of pre and post-election surveys that people are just super dissatisfied with Congress, with the presidency, with all their institutions. The media is way up there. And so, if you're the Democrats, I think there are a number of things that you can kind of be thinking about moving forward. But one of them is probably finding somebody who isn't kind of the clean, polished, cookie cutter candidate that, historically maybe has worked in some ways.
Yeah.
But the last two Democratic presidents, well, there was Joe Biden, who kind of fits the sort of traditional mold, but before him it was Obama and it was Bill Clinton, right, who was also kind of ran against Washington, outsider governor. So I think that's one of the big things that, as the Democrats are looking ahead to what comes next, they have to kind of understand that that's the frustrations that a lot of people are feeling, and really speak to that, right? Not kind of, suggest that those concerns aren't real, or sort of try to ignore them in lieu of their own kind of ideas and things that they care about most. Like, if you want to build a majority that is big enough to win a presidential election, you're going to have to pull some of these people who aren't sold by kind of whatever you've been talking about for the last 4 to 8 years.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think that's absolutely right. So the election happened, early November. Trump has now been in office for just over a month. What would you say? And you're approaching this as, as a liberal patriot, as someone coming from the center left. What is, you would say, something that Trump has done or has talked about doing that you like, that you agree with?
That's a good question. I mean, one of the things that it's all kind of relative, but I think one of the things that certainly he has tapped into, that probably is a little bit overdue, is a conversation about border security. I don't. It's hard to. I don't want to paint with too broad a brush here. I do think that there are a lot of Democratic voters who, over time, have adopted much more liberal attitudes about immigration, not just insofar as it relates to being kind of having warm feelings about immigrants and, immigrant culture, and being kind of more open to multiculturalism and that kind of stuff. But also, there's a not insignificant portion of the Democratic base that sort of de facto believes in an open borders kind of world.
Yeah.
That's not, they may not couch it that way, but they do kind of believe in the free movement of people. That the United States is sort of the wealthiest country in the world, and so it has an obligation to kind of bring in anybody who is disenfranchised from other countries.
Yeah.
And I think there are legitimate debates to be had over kind of the regulation and the flow of immigration, but I do think that over the last 4 years, and some of this was COVID induced, but some of this was also very much in response to domestic policies here. The U.S. started losing its grip on immigration, and so there's certainly ways that Trump has gone about this that I very much disagree with, including trying to overturn basically the birthright citizenship here.
Right.
But he has forced a conversation and forced the Democrats even to really start to kind of seriously grapple with securing the southern border
Yeah.
and having a more kind of common sense, I think, discussion on countries being able to regulate the inflow of migration. I
Yeah.
think that's something that you see in countries all over the world. I mean, Europe has been really dealing with these issues in maybe even a starker way than we have over the past 10 years. But it's a reasonable question for any country to be, who gets to come in, and at what point do we say you have to come through the right channels, and we're going to close off these other ways. So I would like to maybe see him not take quite as much of a ham-fisted approach to it, but I think the focus on that is appropriate for sure.
Yeah. And so, what do you think the likelihood is that Democrats really take a position on this that resonates with the American people, or enough of the American people? You never have to,
Hmm.
get everybody, obviously. Because I think that's kind of what this fundamental question comes back to. So you're at the Liberal Patriot. You're at what is essentially a center left advocacy group looking at Democrats, trying to get Democrats to go in directions that will help them win
Hmm.
elections. How has that been going? Like, what does that look like? Been around since 2021. You've been full time since last year. Um, what what are the conversations like? Whose ear do you have?
Hmm.
What kind of response do you get? Like, recently the DNC elected a whole new slate of leadership. What were your thoughts on that? Like,
Yeah.
yeah, I'd love to get
Yeah.
your commentary on that.
I think it's a mixed bag. I would say on the whole, a lot of the moves I've seen haven't given me a ton of optimism at this point. Um, but
And
I
that's
also think,
because, sorry to interrupt, that's because
sure,
it kinda seems like they're continuing the path they were on prior to the
I think so.
election.
I
Okay,
think
good.
so. Yeah. I just watching some of the video from the DNC gathering where they elected a new chair and other people to other positions. A lot of the stuff that was being said at that gathering just made me concerned that they were not kind of really grappling with why the real reasons why they lost the election. I mean, one example was Washington Post columnist Jonathan Capehart was
Mm,
interviewing several of the candidates for the who were running for chair, and he kind of asked a question that essentially was looking for the answer: yes, Kamala Harris lost because of racism and sexism.
right.
And look, I think you could probably argue reasonably that there were people who harbored those kinds of attitudes who voted against Harris, voted for Donald Trump. But, first of all, and I've written about this previously at Liberal Patriot, that's almost certainly not the reason that she lost, or even among the primary reasons. But it also kind of continues a fixation on identity as like this supreme thing, in racial and gender identity specifically. And I kind of worry that it's going to lead the party to make the mistake of never nominating a woman or a non-white person again for the foreseeable future, which would kind of hamstring them in some, really unfortunate ways. So I think, there have been some people adjacent to the party, I would say, who have, I think, more seriously tried to understand and look at the uncomfortable reasons
Yeah,
why the Democrats lost. They're kind of starting to reflect on questions about immigration, where the party has ventured on that, where the party has ventured on social and cultural issues, how they've kind of become detached from the median voter, working class voters, rural America, places where Democrats were winning a little over a decade ago and have been mostly just wiped out. I think, there are some people who are moving in that direction. And I do think that that is optimistic. But honestly, I think part of the problem right now is that the Democrats don't really have kind of a singular figurehead who is leading the party with a vision of their own. And I think that'll work itself out once we kind of get into the 2028 primaries. But right now you have Chuck Schumer in the Senate, who's never really been thought of as the party leader. You have
Right.
Hakeem Jeffries in the House, who is brand new to his role there. Nancy Pelosi's kind of receded a little bit into the background.
Hmm.
You don't have the executive branch anymore, and the DNC chair is sort of the de facto head of the party, but they will kind of go the way of the eventual nominees. So I'm kind of holding out for a little bit to see both what happens in 2028. I also want to see what kind of candidates the party runs in hard to win places in next year's midterms for the House and for the Senate and governorships. Right now, I believe there are only 3 Republicans representing districts that Kamala Harris won, which means that for the Democrats to win back the House, and they only need a few seats to do so.
Right.
Those 3 might be enough, but to win back the House, they're most likely going to have to extend further into territory that Trump won, and to do that then means you have to really grapple with, why did these voters vote for Trump in the first place, and are you going to run candidates who are capable of talking to these voters and sympathizing with their concerns in a way that resonates with them, so that they can pick up more than just a handful of seats next year.
Yeah. Interesting. And so we're only 35 days into Trump administration
Mm-hmm.
2.0, and so we got a long way to go until the actual midterm,
Yes.
and this time until then will impact how those races go. But is there anything so far, or what are the big things so far that Trump has done or that his administration has done that have made you think, like, you know what, Democrats might have a shot at
Mm-hmm.
not just taking back the House, obviously, which is a relatively low bar given how narrow the lead is, but of making up some real ground in the Senate. And I know you've written that Democrats are facing a bit of a tough road to retake the
Yeah.
Senate,
Yeah.
uh, but not so in the House. And what are what are those things from the last month that really jump out as
Yeah.
opportunities, I think, on the left?
Yeah. I think, coming out of the 2024 election, the top issue, I mean, there were a couple of top issues, but the one that consistently in every pre-election poll, post-election poll, that was at number one was the economy, cost of living, inflation. I think for most people, they, coming out of COVID, when inflation rose and they saw it every day at the grocery store, they saw it at the gas station, they saw it when went out to eat wherever, and housing, that just became a strain on their daily lives. And especially if you're talking about, working class voters who may not have the same kind of financial cushion as other people do,
Hmm.
that really took a toll. And so a lot of people, kind of looked at Biden, who was in power, said, you're to blame. We're going to try and go back to Trump, who had this great economy, in the first 4 years that he was in office. And Trump, and he was running, said, this is going to be like, I'm going to take this on. We're going to fix inflation. Your life is going to be better. And in the first month so far, I looked this up recently. Most of what he has done in this so far in his presidency is issuing executive orders. They're trying to work through, his agenda in Congress, but of course that's going to take some time. So mostly it's just been this early spate of executive orders. And I looked this up, and only 5 of the 73 that he has issued so far even mentioned the term inflation, and none of them were designed to primarily and specifically combat inflation or do anything along those lines. And he's also even said in his first month that Americans need to be prepared for some temporary financial hardship, essentially,
Yeah.
so that he can get his policies into place that theoretically over the long term will then make it easier for them. But
Yeah.
he's basically showing right now that, yeah, this may have been the issue that kind of won him the election, or one of the big issues that did. And even despite that, he's not really focused on addressing it right now. So I think that is a easy opening for Democrats to come in and say, hey, like, you voted for this guy. He said he was going to help you out. Now he's abandoned you. Here are our 1, 2, 3 policies, or our ideas that are going to get this, the ship upright and things back on track here. The other thing is that the early moves of Doge, it's a little bit of a mixed bag. There is, again, kind of to our earlier conversation about people's just general sense of frustration with the
Yeah.
establishment and our federal institutions. There is some support for taking a very close look at reforming a lot of these institutions, but the kind of haphazard way that Elon Musk has gone in and seemingly in some ways almost unilaterally just deciding what programs are going to be cut. A lot of people are not on board with. There was a poll recently I saw, I can't remember who it was from, that said only about a quarter of Americans think that Elon Musk and Doge should have this kind of outsized role in the Trump administration that they have. So already there is quite a bit of trepidation around his Musk's early actions on that front. And then I think what you're going to start to see, I mean, there are some programs that he's attacked that, even though these are things that Democrats might like or think have value, they don't go over well with the public. The number one being probably USAID and foreign aid. It's just something that doesn't pull very well, especially when you have people thinking that there's not enough investment going on here at home.
Yeah.
But the thing with USAID is it's kind of an early test case for how much Musk can get away with in terms of basically gutting an entire department. And while USAID may not impact the daily lives of Americans, other programs might. If he starts training his eyes on Medicaid or Social Security or food and housing assistance, some of these programs may start to impact Trump's own voters.
Right.
And so, again, this kind of you're looking at the things that impact people's daily lives. And this is when Democrats won the House back in 2018. This is kind of the approach that they took. They were candidates were just talking about kitchen table issues. They were talking about healthcare. They were talking about jobs and wages, costs. This is the exact formula that helped them last time. And I think so far, Trump seems to be kind of opening the door for them again to do the same thing this time. Obviously, as you said, we're well over a year out from the midterms. A lot can happen between now and then. But I think what Democrats have to be careful about is chasing everything that kind of would be a compelling reason to them not to vote for Trump. Last time it was sort of the Russia collusion stuff and, kind of things, his Supreme Court picks, but mostly what people are voting on, or at least the swing voters who are going to decide these elections, is stuff that just impacts their day-to-day lives. And I think that's where the opening probably will be again for Democrats this time around.
Yeah. Interesting. Funny. Okay. This is going to sound like a funny question. Maybe, zooming out a little bit. So, as especially as someone who works kind of to try and guide the Democratic Party in a certain direction, what made you a Democrat in the first place, and what makes you a Democrat today?
I like the question. I think the earliest sort of moment of political awakening, if you want to call it that, that I remember having was on the issue of gay marriage. I remember that was kind of becoming sort of a part of the zeitgeist as I was hitting sort of high school, college, and as a millennial who grew up at a time when you started to have gay classmates and people at school that you knew, it just kind of seemed like a no-brainer issue. It seemed like here's a right that's afforded to certain people that other people aren't able to enjoy. This just kind of seems like on its face, like it's a no-brainer to fix that and to extend the same rights to everybody. And it was sort of rooted in a very universalist understanding of or view of the world, which is that if there's kind of a big pie of society that most people have access to, but that some people don't, you should kind of grow the pie a little bit and kind of let other people in, kind of thing. I also just had sort of feelings toward people who had struggled and for potentially came from kind of generations of poverty, these kinds of things. People who just kind of needed a little bit of a hand up, right? Just needed some extra help that maybe were kind of being forgotten by the people in power and who weren't getting the help they needed. So that was kind of what drew me into the Democratic Party politics, and I think still explains why I am today, even as I think some of those things have evolved in ways that I don't I had not fully moved with. I think that the Democrats have moved or liberals maybe is more specifically the way to think about it, have moved from kind of a very universalist idea of universal values, these values that should apply to everybody, to kind of a very identity based way of kind of understanding the population and policies and these kinds of things. And I think instead of seeing a pie that should be grown and more people should have access to, I think it's people kind of see this as either a finite pie, where if somebody else comes in to take one slice, somebody has to be booted out and have their slice given up, or
Mhm.
the pie is just power and oppression and needs to be completely blown up and started from scratch. And I don't totally subscribe to that. I think kind of the classic ideals, liberal ideals, of anti-discrimination, of equality of opportunity, like these things, I think resonate with most people today, and I think are sort of what keep me within the Democratic coalition. I think the Republicans aren't wrong about everything. I think they get some things right, but I have some very big picture issues with the current, especially iteration of the Republican Party, that just they won't have me for a long time, even with all the issues that I still see in the Democratic Party at the
Yeah.
moment.
Can we run down some of those issues, kind of those gates that keep you out of the Republican Party?
Oh, sure. I mean, I think look, one of the biggest issues to me, just as an American, is respecting election results. I think um, peaceful transfer of power is one of the few norms that really has distinguished America and then increasingly other Western democracies from a lot of other countries for a long time.
Yeah.
If you don't have that, then do you really have a healthy democracy? I don't think so. Like that to
Hmm.
me is as a deal breaker. So long as the sort of Trumpian move of not conceding defeat and claiming there was fraud anytime you lose, and that to me, that's not healthy. We can't have that.
Yeah.
I think one of my biggest issues is climate change. I mean, I really,
Hmm.
I plan to have kids and I want an inhabitable planet for them down the road. I also think that the climate leads to other issues that impact people's lives potentially down the road, especially like migration problems, right? And people not fleeing in uninhabitable areas, to come to places like the United States,
Yeah.
and which then overwhelms our immigration system. And so, I think you have to, if you're the Republicans, you have to show me that. I think we're getting there in terms of public opinion and whether climate change is real. We're getting there at a slower rate from Republicans on whether humans contribute to it. But then there's the question of, okay, so even if you believe it's real, even if you believe it's man-made, what are you going to do about it? And I do
Yeah.
think that there are some Republicans who are on that. It's mostly at the local level, and especially in areas like out west, where they see kind of the problems firsthand. But those two are big things. And look, I also realize as I'm saying these are not necessarily always the concerns that voters share, the issues that they prioritize necessarily.
Hmm.
I think this is somewhat representative of my demographic, sort of educated, urban dwelling on the coasts, all these things. So I understand, and I think that is something that when I talk about my critiques of the Democrats, this is what I kind of want them to understand, is that it's totally valid to kind of care about some of these things. Issues like climate change and democracy; those are important issues.
Yeah.
But you have to also speak to other things that people care about. And so, even for me, even though I care about these issues, I understand that those don't necessarily carry the party to victory at the end of the day in hard to win places. But yeah, I think there's a little ways to go, I would say, in terms of the Republicans and winning my vote.
Yeah. So fair. Continuing on that climate change thread.
Hmm.
So that's an interesting one. So when you say, concerned about climate change, impact on
Hmm.
the environment. Okay, so that leads you to Democrats. What is it that Democrats are doing, proposing to do? What did President Biden do that has you stay there? Like what translates that focus or that concern into actual, policies that you agree with?
Yeah. Well, it's a good question, and I think there's a little bit of a. I keep saying this. It's a little bit of a mixed bag here because I think there are ways to do this um, that are to kind of address these issues that are reasonable, that are politically tenable, and effective, like effective strategies to kind of
Yeah.
employ to combat climate change. And then there are other ways that I think are can trend into virtue signaling, can be overreach, can cause backlash and regression in sort of progress in combating this stuff. So I think one of the I personally am a big fan of kind of building up electric infrastructure. I think that's something that has a lot of tangible benefits as well as being good for the environment.
Hmm.
I think somebody who would pretty clearly agree with that actually is Elon Musk. Yeah, sorry, go
Yeah.
ahead.
Well,
Mhm.
so when you say building up electrical infrastructure, what
Mhm.
exactly does that mean?
So, I think part of what I think kind of leads people away from embracing and adopting, EV technology, and
Mm,
specifically in cars, is the sense. Well, there's a few things, but one of them is a sense that these aren't cars that you could drive across the country, right? These are
right.
cars that I forget the term for it, but there's a sense that people have. They have a car that it's like an anxiety, like a battery anxiety or something like that, where you might sort of stall out somewhere and all of a sudden you don't have access to, you don't have a gas station nearby, obviously it doesn't matter, and then you don't have a charging station nearby where you can very quickly charge it up, right? I think that the price tag can kind of scare some people away, and I think that'll change over time as there are more of these cars made. And so, I think that's like kind of one specific, and that's more of an even market um, sort of plan for kind of helping combat climate change, and the government can obviously help encourage that as well. Um, but that's one of the things where I think it can be helpful. I also think that how Democrats talk about this stuff matters.
Hmm.
I think these issues have seemed to have been kind of caught up in broader culture wars, and specifically this idea that it's sort of the government, um, telling people what they should do, right?
Yeah.
And it's it can be EV technology, it can be sort of the gas stove debates, whatever. A lot of these things, that are well-meaning, can then end up coming across as sort of the nanny state, and we know better than you, and we're sort of the educated class telling you, kind of thing. So I think there are. I wouldn't say I have a fully fleshed out vision for how to talk about these things necessarily. It's actually something that I'm thinking about writing about in the not too distant future. But I do think that these are important issues. I do think that the Democrats need to figure out a way to talk about them that resonates with people's daily lives, even if it's kind of setting aside the climate change term and more kind of talking about protecting our lands, right, and
Yeah.
protecting wildlife, right. I think specifically these are arguments that people like John Tester in the past, senator from Montana, have effectively used to win over the votes of more conservative voters, people who are very conservation minded because they're hunters or they're fishers or whatever.
Hmm.
So it's sort of a broad basket of things, and a lot of different ways the Democrats can approach it. But I think it's kind of important to make sure that as they're talking about this, they're putting themselves in the mind of kind of an average voter and not necessarily their more highly educated base or sort of the climate activists that are pushing the party, to go left on that.
Yeah. So, that leads me to kind of two thoughts. So one of them first, so it's funny to have Elon Musk in this position where, he's now very closely allied with Trump, playing a huge role in the early days of this administration, leading Doge, you know, breaking a lot of eggs, maybe or maybe not making omelets. That
Right.
he's he's having a huge impact. But I think if you look back over the last 15 years, it would be difficult to identify any other individual person who has had as big an impact on the uptake with electric cars.
Yep.
Like you look, so I'm talking to you here from Salt Lake City, and there are, you go outside, you look around, you see the cars driving on the road. There are a lot of Teslas.
Yep.
There are not a lot of other electric cars.
It's true.
And it's interesting to think about how Tesla has gotten such a big market share and has gotten people to buy these cars, even in conservative areas, has gotten conservatives to buy these
Hmm.
cars in conservative areas. And I couldn't tell you all the reasons for that. I have no idea how much of that has to do with Elon's recent, dive into politics. I do think it probably helps that they have had manufacturing issues, so I can't say this for all of them. But the cars they're cool cars.
Yeah.
Like when you get one of those cars, obviously there are some things you give up when you get an electric car that you have right now with gas. Like, it's easier to drive across the country and fill up your tank very quickly when you're driving a gas
Hmm.
car than easier doing gas than electric. But those cars are incredibly fast. They have great design, with the, I think, mammoth exception of the Cybertruck.
Correct.
Although that's like, I think the sedans are beautiful, the SUVs look good, and then
Yeah.
the Cybertruck is an affront to God. But then at the
Yeah.
same time, it has this like unique look where you can see people
Sure. Sure.
getting it. Um, and then the other thing that I think Republicans have, if they haven't done a better job of it, they've certainly associated themselves with it better, and that's with uh, the government either actually getting stuff done or getting out of the way so the private sector can get stuff done.
Hmm.
Because you look, I my wife and I, we live in, and our son, we live in Salt Lake now, but we lived in New York for the last number of years, and I was uh, love California, born in San Francisco. Uh, there's this perception, fair or not, and I think a lot of it is probably fair, that uh, places that have remained under Democratic control for a long time, and in particular these big cities, really struggle to govern.
Yeah.
They introduce just so many well-intended
Hmm.
laws and regulations that you can't build.
Hmm.
Like it basically, it's like you want to do all these good environmental things, but then you introduce so many barriers in the way that you can't actually get them done. Whereas you talk to people that are investing in the expansion of alternative energy and everything like that, and they want to go to states like Texas,
Correct.
where maybe there isn't such an explicit push to do climate change friendly things, but you have the ability to do it. You have the flexibility to
Hmm.
do it. I would be really interested to get your
Yeah.
thoughts on that.
Yeah. So I guess there's a couple of things there. I think your observation about Musk is interesting. I think I've he drives a lot of liberals mad, but he also is sort of the old school Silicon Valley types who, among other things, care about climate change. And
Yeah.
it has been interesting to see, even on X. Uh, Musk will, I mean, he will be on MAGA's side on a lot of things these days, but whenever the issue of climate change has come up, he has gently, but he has often pushed back and said, no, this theory that you've heard is not correct, or whatever. And it's been very interesting. And it does make me wonder to some extent, whether that will shape the Trump administration's approach to, for example, the EV tax credits that
Hmm.
came out under the Biden administration. We'll see. It also depends on how long Musk and Trump remain friends, and I'm a little bit skeptical that that's going to go on for that much longer. But we'll see. But to your point on the Democrats' governing woes, that has been one of the things that it's been an underrated factor, I think, in kind of the long-term trajectory of people self-identifying as Democrats and voting for Democrats.
Hmm.
It's not hard to look at population trends and see a pretty stark picture, which is Democratic run states and cities are losing population, and purple to Republican states are booming.
Yeah.
There are a couple of exceptions here or there, but that's kind of the big picture. People are leaving California, New York, Illinois, places that aren't necessarily. I mean, some of that could, maybe goes back to, still kind of bleeding out from post-manufacturing era, but a lot of that I think is, and especially the spike in that migration is relatively new.
Hmm.
And it's not hard to see why. I mean, you look at sort of the post-COVID era specifically, and you see, surging crime rates. You saw much stricter and protracted lockdowns that other places
Hmm.
didn't get, including well after the science, supported that, which seemed like it was kind of part of a cultural milieu in some of these places.
Yeah.
Um, you see in some areas like San Francisco and Portland, higher rates of homelessness. You see just a struggle to use the city's resources to care for the people of these cities. And then you kind of look at who's governing them, and it's sort of no wonder. I mean, you look at Brandon Johnson in Chicago. Just today, there was a poll that came out. He's at 7% approval rating, which is mind blowing in a
It's
city as
impressive.
Democrat. Is really, you have to try, yeah, to get there. It's mind blowing in a city as democratic as Chicago. That
Yeah.
he's that far underwater. You look at New York, and you have Eric Adams, who kind of came in as sort of this interesting character who, kind of beat back the progressive, candidates, and had the support from kind of the multiracial working class. And all of a sudden, he's sort of, off and doing his own thing now, and sort of being indicted for crimes and stuff. And so, you kind of look at this big picture, and you're sort of wondering, where is the like model democratic run, cities and states? Where are these
Yeah.
places that people are thinking, that's where I want to move? Cost of living is reasonable. They have good schools. They have, crime under control, these kinds of questions. And it's kind of hard to pinpoint that. And then you look and see where people are moving, and it's places where cost of living is lower. It is easier to buy a house. It is easier to make renovations on those homes. It's easier to kind of just build more
Yeah.
generally. And so I do think this is one of the things that it's probably not the reason Democrats lost in this last election. It's probably not the primary reason they've even been losing support among or working class voters. But you have to at some point kind of ask whether their path out of the wilderness maybe starts through getting their own kind of internal affairs in order.
Yeah.
Bringing some of these once proud cities. I mean, New York City has been forever, one of the premier destinations for people all over the world to come visit, to come and live.
Yeah.
And you hear people locally talking about it right now, and they're all frustrated. They're frustrated with, the fact that the city is using resources to put up, migrants in hotels instead of, using it to kind of clean up the streets. They're not responding well to crime on subways, these kinds of things. And, it's sort of a sad indictment of those cities. And so I do think that, if the Democrats can find a candidate, one, maybe a handful who can run in some of these upcoming mayoral races in these places, and kind of work and start to get these cities turned around, those might be people to watch kind of over the longer term for, future party leaders. Because I think, that's what's going to gain back voters' trust, that this is a
Yeah.
responsible party that is capable of, adult governing, dealing to the problem, tending to the problems that, impact our daily lives, and don't get kind of caught up in things that we really don't care about.
So that's really interesting. Get that this idea of getting caught up in things we don't really care about, because I think one thing that that has happened during the Trump era, especially, and I'm young enough that I don't I'm 35. Like, I don't have a great idea of certainly what was happening before Obama, and then even during Obama, really starting to kind of ramp up,
Hmm.
and you
Hmm.
know, figure out my own positions on things, and kind of the background things. And the thing about Trump is that he is so provocative, and intentionally so. He's just a generationally gifted provocateur
Yeah.
with, decades of training on TV. Like, there are some things he's so unbelievably good at, and getting a rise out of people is near the top of that list.
Oh yeah.
And I think what he has wrought, and I think he knows he's doing it. He forces Democrats into taking positions that Democrats never would take if they were going up against someone who is a little more just plain vanilla, and
Hmm.
less controversial. Because it's like, okay, so he's going to do something on immigration and whatnot. It's like, okay, we're going completely the other
Yep.
direction,
Yep.
and he's going to deregulate. It's like, well, dang, okay, we're going to regulate.
Yep.
And you just kind of do it like that, where you're trying to mirror image him. And so I think one of the biggest things that I'm interested in, right now, seeing the Democratic reaction to the initial stages of his term, and then kind of thinking about where we go from here. It's like it would be so easy, and I don't think it's unlikely for Democrats to, uh, kind of do what I think they've done to some degree over the last number of years, which is form a platform that is essentially made in opposition to
Mhm.
Trump, or heavily influenced, more influenced by that than you would want. And then that they might actually win. That's and
Yeah.
that's
Yep.
I talked to
Yep.
Republicans about this. It's like because he's so controversial, he does cap himself, and he like maybe he gets punished more than a normal president would for things his administration does poorly,
Mhm.
because they kind of get bugged with him. And so Democrats will get good results in the midterms, and then Biden wins in
Yep.
2020.
Yep.
And I think, you over assume why you won.
Yeah.
You don't just, it's not just that, people rejected Trump. It's like they want FDR style presidency. This is a genuine mandate,
Yeah.
and let's regulate. And,
Yeah. No, I mean that's a really great observation. This was also something that I wrote about not long ago, where um, there's a couple different strands here. So I think first of all, that's correct. That I think Trump he is, even in an era of hyperpolarization, he is so uniquely polarizing that a lot of his detractors, it's just whatever he does, we do the opposite. I think one of the
yeah,
most kind of interesting um, examples of this was, it was something that wasn't even really political at first, but it was the question of where COVID came from. Was it a lab
oh,
leak? Was it a lab leak,
yeah,
or was it from a wet market or something? And there were sort of these theories flowing out here, and then Trump came out, said he thought it was from a lab, and immediately that became not just a conspiracy theory, but a racist conspiracy theory. And the most obvious kind of alternative to that was that it obviously came from a wet market, which is definitely a less racist theory for
right, yeah,
for where this came from.
yeah. It's not a
Um,
lab. It's that the Chinese are eating bats.
exactly,
Right,
exactly,
yeah,
yeah. And it just kind of crystallized this dynamic. And so, yeah, you're right. I think it has, when the way that you operate as a party is rooted so deeply in opposition to the thing you don't like,
yeah,
that causes some cognitive biases and distortions. It puts up blind spots to where your weaknesses might be. And to your point, we live in a two-party system right now. We're in an era of hyper competitive elections because the floor and the ceiling are both narrower.
yeah,
So it only takes a handful of votes to swing elections one way or another. So inevitably, the Democrats will win elections. They're going to win elections again in the future. They will most likely, barring a catastrophic meltdown, they will probably flip the House. They might come close, although it'll be harder in the Senate. But they're gonna make some gains next year in the midterms.
yeah,
And I think what parties have to be very careful about, to your point, is over interpreting what the results of any given election meant, and really trying to figure out what was the real story here. So what I wrote about previously was that Democrats arrived at 2024 with a grave misunderstanding of where the country was and what the country wanted, because of the lessons they drew from both of the last elections, the 2020 presidential and the 2022 midterms. People go back to 2020 and they look at that election and they look at the electoral college map and they say, oh, this wasn't even close. Biden won. It's like 232 to 226 or something along those lines. That's a pretty, healthy margin. Uh,
sorry, 332 to
I'm
2,
sorry,
or
332.
yeah,
Yes, yeah,
yeah,
somewhere around there. So,
yeah,
and it was a pretty healthy margin. And
yeah,
but what it missed, and he won the national popular vote by about 4 points. But what it missed was that there were three states in the electoral college that if they had all three gone the other direction to Trump, Trump would have won. And across those three states, Biden only won by 40,000 votes or 44,000 votes. It was very narrow.
yeah,
And and down ballot, outside of the presidential election, Republicans had actually a decent election. They made inroads in the House. They kind of blunted Democrats' gains in the state legislatures. And
hmm,
so the story of that election might have been, oh, well, people were kind of fed up with Trump, or they didn't trust him to handle COVID, which was their top issue at the time. But they didn't necessarily say, we're going to hand all the keys back to the Democrats. I mean, you looked at The House, they had a narrow margin. The Senate, they had a 50-50 split with Kamala Harris as a tiebreaker. So that's not by any means, the kind of mandate that an FDR or an LBJ or an Obama, had
Right.
coming into office. So you have to
Right.
kind of really grapple with what the story of that was. I think there was just such jubilation of defeating Trump that it was like, oh, well, this was a mandate from the country. You fast forward to the midterms, and there were a handful of factors that kind of culminated in the worst way for Republicans. They had Dobbs in the summer of
Mm,
2022 that overturned Roe v. Wade, and they ran a number of extreme candidates in these battleground states where the kind of the deciding swing seats for the Senate and for governorships were taking place, and the Democrats were able to, in these high profile important races, they were able to win most of those because of those two things, because of the extreme Republicans and because of Dobbs kind of engendering
right.
more turnout in those states among their voters. But nationally, Republicans won the House vote by, I think it was 2 or 3 points. So it gives you kind of a view of the mood of the electorate nationally. And outside of those swing states, it was a pretty normal Republican wave election. But that's not what people paid attention to. They paid attention to the main swing states and came up with a story. And that story was that if there are MAGA candidates on the ballot, and as long as Roe v. Wade has been overturned, Democrats are going to have this groundswell of support that comes out, and they're going to oppose the Republicans. And then they kind of carried that with them into 2024, and they lost. And
Yeah.
so, I think it's all maybe a call for a little bit of humility in victory. When you win an election, good for you, but take time to really assess what, step back from that victory, maybe a little bit after the dust has settled, and kind of figure out, okay, what was the big picture here? What were the big takeaways? What did people say their motivating issues were? Because in the midterms, a lot of people still cared about the economy. It wasn't just abortion,
Right.
and that drove support in a lot of these places. So, I think right now, and this kind of gets back to what we were talking about earlier with the 2024 results. Democrats would be wise to kind of take a step back, even in the frenzy of kind of the early days of Trump, and really try to get an accurate reading of why they lost. And because if they don't, then they risk kind of falling into the same traps as last time, which is just oppose Trump, whatever he does, we do the opposite. And then maybe they have a good midterm next year, and all of a sudden, well, we've got our formula figured out. And then who knows what happens in 4 years, but it's probably not what they're hoping for.
Yeah. That, yeah. You mentioning the losses by Trump aligned MAGA,
Mm-hmm.
big guy Republicans in 2022. It was interesting how people took that. And like what I take out of that is that Trump himself the reality is he is charismatic.
Yeah,
Not to everybody, or maybe he is to everybody. It's just kind of the opposite
sure.
way. He's provocative. He can pull things off that most people, the vast majority of people, cannot
Right.
pull off. Um, I'm not sure. Like if you had to list out 5 reasons he can pull it off, I'm not sure what those 5 reasons would be. But the dude can do things that other people can't do.
Mm-hmm.
And so when people try to copy him, a lot of them they fall short, they lose their elections. And
Yeah.
Republicans I think have taken lessons from that to some degree. I don't know if their primary voters have, but you've certainly seen national Republicans talk about how, like, these candidates, these particularly Trump aligned candidates, have not done well, have
Mm-hmm.
underperformed.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but then yeah, no, it's just kind of funny to think about. I think what Democrats, particularly those who are so, um, I think reactively, reflexively opposed to anything Trump does. I think you really have to grapple with the idea that it's not even necessarily his policies or whatever that are popular. Like he himself has a
Yeah.
particular
He he does.
charisma
Yeah.
that's very different from, but in kind of similar to the charisma you might have seen with an Obama, who I think was a really charismatic figure. Clinton, I think, was a really charismatic figure. It's
Mm-hmm.
very different, but he is that same sort of, I think, kind of towering
Yeah.
figure.
It's very true. Yeah, I think that is why that probably contributed to a lot of the losses in 2022. People were trying to kind of be a Trump 2.0 mini me, whatever, and they just couldn't do it. It wasn't. It didn't sell to them the way that Trump did. And the reason, Trump has people kind of, I think, don't understand that sometimes people are drawn to a specific person's story, right? And
Yeah.
so for Trump, there are a lot of people who really uh, believe he's a successful businessman, and they value that. They think that that's kind of part of the American story, right? Is that this guy,
Yeah.
built this empire, and that's something that maybe they want to do one day. That they want to aspire to kind of do something similar. And another thing that I think Trump has going for him that I don't think most of his opponents on the Republican side have the stomach to do in the same way he does is he is abjectly shameless. There is nothing there's nothing that you can really say that he feels remorse for, or
Yeah.
you're right, that I shouldn't never. It's sort
Yeah.
of a never, and it's kind of core to his being. And so if a scandal kind of comes his way, he slept with a porn star, or he did whatever, it just kind of brushes off, because it's sort of like, well, I'm not upset about it, so why should anybody else be? And other
Yeah.
people are like, okay, whatever, it's not a big deal. But in some ways, for other candidates, people look at that and they're like, wait, so does nothing matter?
Right.
Is there no behavior that is too far beyond the pale anymore for anybody? But then you just look at other candidates and you see, well, the laws of political gravity, kind of still do apply. I mean, even on the Democratic side in 2020, they lost a Senate seat in North Carolina that may have been a really important seat for them, because their candidate had an affair, and it came out a couple months
Mm.
before the election. Even in the year 2022, I think that was, or 2020, that kind of thing still matters. And so, I agree. I think insofar as a lot of these candidates are trying to be Trump, they just don't. They don't have the story he has, and so
Yeah.
therefore they don't have the unique branding to people to be
Yeah.
compelling in that way.
Yep.
And a lot of them, at the end of the day, just don't. They won't go all the way to do the kinds of things that Trump does. I mean, people are kind of fret about, especially Democrats. Oh, are we going to ever have another January 6th? Are we going to have people following this kind of charismatic leader to into battle kind of thing? And I don't know. I'm skeptical. I mean, I think Trump has that unique appeal to kind of bring people into the fold, and sort of have them
Yeah.
do what he wants. I don't know that there's another Republican who has that ability. At least nobody
Yeah.
that comes to mind currently.
Yeah. Let me make one more point of that, and then I want to ask you a question. We got to
Sure,
get into
sure.
this good stuff. So, in the aftermath of the election, so Pod Save America, they did an episode with the four, campaign
Hmm.
manager people from the Harris campaign, uh, which I think to a lot of Democrats was a frustrating exercise, because
Hmm.
there was not a whole lot of I don't know, it felt like they weren't really
A lot of self
reckoning.
reflection. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, right.
yeah.
Not a whole ton of really productive self-reflection, but it was interesting. Quentin Fulks, who I thought was one of the more productive participants in that conversation, he said something, and I wrote about this in November or December. He said, Republicans don't make Trump apologize. And
Hmm.
what was funny is that, like, yeah, I think now that's probably accurate, but it didn't start out that way. People they all asked him to apologize.
Yeah.
There were dozens of Republicans, dozens of very prominent national leader level Republicans that wanted him to drop out of the presidential race
Hmm.
against Hillary Clinton 1 month before the
Yeah.
election. Less than a
Yeah.
month before the election. That is, I mean, they knew that that is akin to political suicide, and they knew
Hmm.
that. And they were willing to do that because, they believed that he had done something sufficiently wrong that
Hmm.
do that. Like, he got asked to apologize as much or more than anyone else, but he didn't apologize. Not really. Maybe he apologized for that and said, I
Sure.
shouldn't have done it. But then moves on.
Yeah.
And then he won.
Yep.
And then he kept doing that. And after a while, people are like, well, not going to waste my breath, because one, he's not going to apologize. Two, he's winning.
Yeah.
And I think, there's a degree. It's not exactly right to say might makes right, but there is a degree to which that's true. And you could even say that about Biden. Obviously he's not Trump, But if you look at him relative to the other 2020 candidates that he was running against, he was, I think, the least apologetic,
Hmm.
the most
Sure.
likely. I would say, maybe Bernie is also not a
Hmm.
particularly apologetic person. He's strident in his views, but he's far enough left that kind of that handicaps him a little bit.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, there. I think that the broader point is that people want goodness, they want morality, but I think they want strength.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. I think something that sort of a through line between Trump and Bernie and Biden is that all of them had kind of uh, uh, their own reason for running, their own vision, and things that they were kind of tethered to that kind of prevented them from being pulled by kind of interest groups and people who were sort of trying to say, because I think that is something that it sort of exudes a typical politician aura around a candidate when people see them, say one thing and then they get a backlash for it, and then they feel like, oh, okay, I have to respond to the backlash instead of saying, no, I'm sticking to my guns. I know who I am. I know what I meant. If people took it the wrong way, that's their problem, kind of thing. I think you're right. It is sort of a sign of strength. It's a sign of that they know who they are. They have their own convictions that they're sticking to, and I wonder a little bit if that is the kind of thing that um, is going, it would aid any kind of candidate moving forward. I do
Yeah,
think I agree. I think it's a reason why Trump is able to get away with a lot of the things that he gets away with, because his voters love that about him. He
yeah,
doesn't constantly, he's not apologizing all the time, and he's not backtracking. I mean, he does backtrack on some of his policies, but he won't ever admit to it.
yeah, right.
That's what he's doing, right? And so we're kind of talking about what is it going to look like for the Democrats? Who are they going to put up in 4 years? I don't know that you want to completely embrace that, because there is
Hmm.
some, again, I think some level of shame can be just a good human thing.
Yeah.
Um, but I do think, for your point about Biden, I think this is going to be true for whoever comes next. I think Biden knew who he was, and he knew, he did not specifically within the Democratic coalition feel that he needed to always um, reform himself based on whatever the loudest objections of his party's left base were. Right?
Right.
He said, "No, you're wrong on that." Or he may not have explicitly said it, but he acted that way. Right? He's like, "I
Yeah.
don't need to kind of go in this direction that you're pushing me, or I don't need to apologize. I know what I meant." And I think people respect these presidential candidates for that. Right? I think
Yeah.
it kind of gives off some sense of independence, that that they will do what they think is right, and not necessarily kind of always be at the whims of their party's base. So anyway, I think to your point though about Trump, I agree. I think that's a big reason why most Republicans have just kind of given up, or, at some point, on trying to reform him, because it seemed to work, and it's
Yeah.
still working.
Yeah. It's like it worked, and then he just he politely passed on reform. He's like,
Right,
I'd rather not.
right.
I'm not going to do that. And then he wins, and people are like, okay.
Yeah.
The Yeah. So speaking of weakness, it's interesting. Biden ran. I think Biden really he prided himself on his experience in foreign policy.
Hmm.
And I think, talking to Republicans, over the last couple of years, and even feeling myself, it's like you look at Biden's administration and then Harris's campaign, and one thing that I think really held them back actually was foreign policy, and I think it's funny why. If you look at, because I think the through line is a perception from the American people that what the American government was doing was in some way weak. And you look at Afghanistan, it's like, okay, we withdraw, doesn't go particularly well, looks
Yeah.
really bad. Taliban takes over the country in like a week, and it looks weak,
Hmm.
and Biden, I think, tries to reframe like, no, we got out of the country, and I did what prior presidents had refused to do. And it's like, well, okay, you know, pat yourself on the back, but like it
Right.
looked,
That's
it
one piece
looked,
of it.
yeah, it's like it looked, it it would have been tough to have, done something that looked worse.
Right.
It looked
Right.
weak. And then the second thing was, so, here Trump is claiming now, we're in this period where Trump is, he's pushing very hard, very actively to end the Russia-Ukraine
Hmm.
war.
Hmm.
Obviously, he has taken some positions that a great many people are not particularly happy with, or has taken his positions in a way that people are not particularly happy with. But, he has made this claim that the war never would have started had he been in
Sure.
office.
Sure.
And that's a counterfactual you can't actually know.
Yeah.
But what you can know, what voters know, is that it did happen when Biden was in
Hmm.
office.
Hmm.
And then also that while we were providing a considerable amount of aid to Ukraine, we were the whole time uh, we were kind of handicapping what they could do with it.
Yeah.
It's like, you can't, basically, we're putting limits on their military as far as their ability to counterattack into
Right.
Russia.
Right.
Kind of like, we want to support you, but we're a little nervous about
Yeah.
provoking Russia.
Yeah.
And then you add Israel Gaza into it, where we're providing, Biden, he took this middle path where he makes both sides mad, because obviously
Hmm.
we're still providing a whole lot of materiel to Israel. Um, so that's making the pro-Palestine left kind of mad,
Hmm.
and then he is hesitating to do so, and is kind of annoyed about it, which is making the right mad. But then, perhaps most importantly, I think it doesn't, to the extent that Israel is on a leash getting all this American aid, kind of looked like they were the ones pulling Biden. It
Yep.
looked like,
Yep.
Biden would tell Netanyahu, you can't do X, you can't do Y. Netanyahu's like, okay, does X, does Y,
Right.
continues to get, whatever he needs. Uh, and you just, it's again and again and again, this idea that there's this professional class of American politician,
Hmm.
an entrenched interest that just is kind of weak.
Yeah.
And I think, maybe that's something people would overlook if they were happier generally with what the federal government was doing.
Yeah.
But in a time when, it is more difficult to get housing, it is more expensive to go to college. It's, I think that if you adjust for inflation, median wages have real wages have gone down over time. There's going to be there's going to be a frustration with the government. You add it all together, and it's like, well, okay, you look at all that, and it kind of makes a lot of sense that Trump
Yeah.
won.
Yeah. Yeah. It's an interesting way of thinking about it. I do. Right. I think that part of the reason, I mean, you kind of see this in Biden's early approval rating changes, which was it was
Right.
dipping a little bit by summer, but it went underwater right after the Afghanistan withdrawal.
Yeah.
And I, my suspicion is that that was really the first time when Americans' fears about Biden's age and his
Mm,
ability to really do this kind of set in a way that said, "Oh, this is the real world manifestation of this. This guy is old and weak,"
right.
and he never recovered. I mean,
Right.
it went down into the low 40s, high 30s, and it just stayed there.
Yeah.
And and then you kind of saw over time just increasing drips of videos of Biden and looking frail and weak. And I think a lot of this compounded all of his actions abroad, right? So when
Yeah.
you see what sort of tepid support for Ukraine, or kind of getting jerked around by Netanyahu, it just kind of reinforced. It was there were all kinds of these things, including on the home front too, but these were just all little instances of this guy is too old, he's too weak, he's too frail to be doing this job effectively, and it's making us look like we don't know what we're doing on the international stage. It's making him incapable of fixing our problems on the home front. All this obviously culminates in his debate against Trump, where the entire country, kind of sees it, right? And
Yeah.
I really think that it's hard to shake people's first impressions of you, and even during the 2020 campaign, that was one of his biggest weaknesses, was that people thought he was too old. He was campaigning from his basement. He was vulnerable
Yeah.
more so than Trump or whatever. And I think that, people kind of followed him into his presidency. And then, you have one thing here or there that just kind of reminds people of it, and then you can't shake it anymore. And so I think that certainly, I don't know if that was, a core reason why he was doing so poorly against Trump or why Harris struggled, but it didn't help for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah. Let me. We've been going on for a while now. Let me, and imagine you have things to do with your day. So let me ask you three final questions. You need to
Sure, let's do
respond
it.
as quickly or longly as you want.
All right.
I don't know if longly is a word. Anyway, uh, the first one is. Oh shoot! Now I'm gonna forget the questions. The first one is, what's your reaction if someone says this is a coup?
Of what's happening right now.
Yeah.
I think that's a little bit of histrionics. I think I understand people's frustrations. I understand people's concerns. Right now, things are still working through the normal democratic process, and the courts are sorting things out. You know, if Trump starts to ignore court rulings and do the things he wanted to do anyway, we can kind of revisit the question of whether this is veering into sort of autocratic means. But he was legitimately elected, and everybody who's been appointed, including Elon Musk, was done so through the proper ways. If people have a problem with that, we should maybe talk about reforming it later. But this is all
Yeah.
democratic right now.
Yeah. Okay. Nice. Good answer. Second, if you had one top priority policy that you, Michael
Mhm.
Baharaeen, that you want Democrats to adopt and pursue, one
Mm.
policy priority, what would that be?
Ooh, that's a great question. Um, I want to say something that would. I'm not sure this is a fully fleshed out policy idea, but something that would kind of work toward restoring trust in government and transparency in government. And I don't know if that's something
Hmm.
around elections or kind of an anti corruption act of some kind. But I think right now, one of the biggest liabilities for the Democrats is that they are the party defending institutions that believes in the importance and the power of these institutions at a time when these institutions are at, at least for modern times, historic lows. And
Yeah.
so you have to give people something that to make them kind of um, rekindles their trust in government. So I think something that, whether it's banning insider trading,
Mm.
or a campaign finance reform law, or something that shows people that you're serious about trying to make government working for the people again, I think that's probably a wise place to go right now.
Nice. Yeah. That's a big,
Yeah.
but good answer. And then final question, what makes you optimistic for the future?
I have always tried to be kind of an optimist about America. I think, at a time, even right now, when people are fearful and distrusting and kind of losing hope in the country, I think, there are a lot of things that are going well. I mean, I think, we're a country that has been through worse times in the
Yeah.
past, right? I mean, we fought a civil war. A lot of people are old enough now and still have a memory of the 1960s, when we had public assassinations and a very unpopular war abroad and struggles on the home front domestically. You had rising inflation heading into the 70s. I mean, all these things, and we persevered through it. And do I think there are things that need to be reformed in the country? Absolutely.
Hmm.
I think we have a lot of hard work to do ahead of us. One of the things that does concern me the most is kind of the country's ever growing tribalism and
Mm.
polarization, and kind of coming to see political opponents as something more than just an opponent, but more as an enemy.
Yeah.
Um, and I do think that we need to work on that. But I think the thing that gives me the hope is that in the past, when we've hit moments like this, we've persevered. I think there are great projects going on all across the country trying to get people of different political persuasions talking again, something that's become increasingly difficult in an online era. I think people are starting to kind of see and become more aware of things that are making us angrier and are making us more distrustful of each other, and trying to kind of put those aside. A lot of people are getting off Facebook and sort of trying to better have healthier relationships with social media in general. And I think all that is
Yeah.
good, because I think people are tired of just being angry all the time. They're tired of being, depressed and fearful of what comes next. And hopefully that then channels itself into productive outlets. And I feel like I've been seeing some of that, and I'm hopeful that that will continue.
That, I think, is a great answer. I would note that I think that's something the Liberal Patriot does
Yes,
or tries to do.
we
That's
try.
certainly
Yeah.
something I'm trying to do. And I do think, it's funny, since I've started this, there's a tiny part of me that's selfishly disappointed to see so many good and smart people rowing in that direction, because it's like, dang, I want that market angle. But then, speaking as an American, it really is, I think, great to see people working harder to question their own priors and understand where their neighbors are coming from.
Yeah, I agree.
And
I agree.
yeah, it's huge. Well, thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks,
And
Nick. This was fun.
yeah, so awesome. Great talking. All right. And that was the interview. Thank you very much for listening. If you wouldn't mind, please do leave a review for the podcast. I believe those are important. And subscribe to the newsletter, which will be linked in the show notes or can be found at neverclosetheinquiry.substack.com. Thanks.